In the interest of providing context for future videos, I felt the need to shed light on my personal survival philosophies. To me, there's a big difference between living within society and true self-reliance. I call this self-reliance survival out of sheer convenience. Survivalists argue the context of when their skills should and will be put to use constantly, because the situational context matters greatly to the type of preparations that are pertinent to make. A system or set of skills designed to get you back to society would be vastly different from the preparations one would make to escape it. So context matters. My context is based around escaping and abandoning society. This is because modern society is a house of cards. Our population is inflated to critical levels, and our economies are only backed by perpetual debt. Modern people are completely dependent on consumerism, and therefore a major breakdown in our logistical train would prove disastrous. The potential for socioeconomic collapse grows every day our society becomes more morally and physically bankrupt, while the quantity of non-productive people climbs. Beyond a simple collapse due to the lack of resources, there is also a potential for society to become morally uninhabitable to the survivalist. If the social contract requires one to compromise on their personal beliefs, religion, or health, it's not hard to imagine why a person may decide the need to reject society and rely only on themselves. This is an idea that most survivalists cannot face. The idea that society will remain in session when their own personal apocalypse takes place. Unfortunately, the nature of such an arrangement would naturally be illegal. This is, in my opinion, the ultimate worst-case scenario. The survivalist, now turned outlaw, would be denied the very rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in the name of collective safety or compliance with tyranny. In this video, I'd like to shed some light around the common misconceptions about true self-reliance in this context. Part 1. False independence. In America, when we historically think of the people who actually survived here, we usually think of Native Americans, pilgrims, mountain men, frontiersmen, and pioneers, and we still use a lot of the techniques from their days that allow us to live independent of the goods and services provided by other people. The question is, were these people truly self-sufficient? If they weren't, we wouldn't be here, right? Well, it's true that they, in the plural sense, were self-reliant. But the problem with modern survival is that the modern survivalist is mostly alone. I'm sure there were exceptions, but here are the generalities. Indians had the help and trade of their tribes. Pilgrims and pioneers had their communities and traded, and even the secluded mountain men and frontiersmen had their rendezvous to sell their furs and trade for needed supplies. We can see a common theme here in the importance of trade and community to provide the necessary resources for sustainment. For those who are religious, the Bible is very clear in Revelation who will be allowed to trade and who will not. For those who aren't religious, a socioeconomic collapse would cause society's population to implode on itself due to the substantial unfilled needs of millions. There will likely be no standing communities, no medium of exchange, and no advanced infrastructure to provide you with the consumable technology in which you are dependent. Those that study survival look at history and how these examples of our ancestors chose to do things. The problem is, those that study tend to make the false correlation that all of their techniques and technology are still viable in the modern world or viable when practiced by a single person, i.e., it worked for them, so it'll work for me. A lot of their techniques require technology that they themselves could only acquire through trade and could not be sustainably reproduced in their natural environment. Also, a lot of their techniques had infrequent success, and that required additional help from their communities to survive in between their successful attempts at acquiring major resources. Consumable technology is effective, but requires significant infrastructure to be available to any given person. In modern society, the convenience and profitability of consumable technology gave rise to rampant consumerism that is currently causing worldwide pollution, poverty, and human dependence on the greater social structures. It's important to recognize that certain resources are always going to be consumable in the sense that they are used up and discarded. The difference that a modern survivalist must know is whether or not he can source the consumables that he is dependent on from the naturally recurring resources in the wilderness itself. The measure of someone's ability to sustain oneself in any given environment without the support of other people is called their autonomy. The ultimate goal in long-term survival is infinite autonomy. The systems you develop will naturally boil down to their base autonomical limitations, and that's where a survivalist should focus when attempting to become truly independent. The modern survivalist, upon leaving the confines of society, cannot depend on trade and transactions to fill the gaps in his systems. This means replacing or repairing the equipment you depend upon. Survivalists in this scenario cannot depend on communities or their tribe to cover their mistakes or support them by bringing additional skills, capabilities, and manpower to the table. There is only you, and perhaps those who depend upon you. It is said that no man is an island unto himself. The very goal of self-reliance is to be just that island. The fear is that non-compliance with a tyrant's change to the social contract would cut off the survivalist from the legal protections that allow him to use accepted currency, gain legal employment, and most importantly, own land. If one cannot own land, then he's cut off from the ability to produce or store the resources he needs to live in a stationary manner. Without a permanent residence, a man will be reduced to a hunter-gatherer lifestyle where his needs must be provided by nature. Knowledge and technology are force multipliers and are likely the only thing that will give a modern person a snowball's chance in hell at living for an extended period of time outside of civilized society. This is especially true when considering the weight constraints of mobile survival systems. Part 2. Modern Environmental Misconceptions. The modern wilderness is very different than it was in the days of our ancestors. The truth is, much of this country has been tamed or destroyed. There aren't endless amounts of wilderness anymore, and even though certain favored species have recovered miraculously due to conservation efforts, there isn't anywhere near as much wild game to be hunted as there used to be. The amount of animals that can live in a given area is known as carrying capacity. This capacity is dictated by the amount of resources like food necessary for game species to survive and reproduce. Roads, infrastructure, and public use make most areas unfit for game species and therefore have greatly reduced the carrying capacity of our wilderness areas. This is called habitat destruction, and it's the reason why modern survivalists don't have anywhere near as many resources available to us as there were before in the time of our ancestors. Because of unsustainable market hunting, urban growth, pollution, and the loss of habitat, wild game numbers have been thinned down to a level at which the modern survivalists must now exploit more potent technology to better utilize the scarcer resources. The knowledge of how to survive in the wilderness has been handed down to us through generations and has evolved as technology gave us additional advantages. In the days of the Indians, the animals were more abundant and less pressured. This meant that older technologies like spears, atlatls, and bows were significantly more viable than they would be today. After all, several Indian braves hunting with bows or spears had a far higher chance of group success than a modern survivalist would if hunting the same primitive technology solo. I won't say that survival is impossible with these primitive tools, just that it's less likely when compared to the more advanced tools of today. It's also important to remember that in a situation where a man would exist outside of functioning society long term, that the majority of his actions would be considered illegal and thereby require a more clandestine approach to the acquisition of resources. The technology you depend on, then, should be suited to the task of protecting, sheltering, watering, and feeding your body in a way that doesn't put you at risk of discovery by some predatory element. The most obvious resource that comes to mind when contemplating this is ammunition for firearms. Modern firearms are a survival superpower. It makes food hard to worry about when you can basically take advantage of any hunting opportunity within line of sight. The problem, however, is that bullets themselves cannot be created by a survivalist in the wilderness, and therefore are a limited consumable resource. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't have any guns with you. It just means that they can become an autonomical limitation long term if you are dependent upon them for need of food. This limitation is exacerbated in mobile systems due to the weight constraints on the supply of ammunition. This channel is pro-Crossbow chiefly because of this specific limitation. I do still carry firearms for security, but the goal is to avoid using them and their ammunition at all costs. This meaning that the use of that ammunition represents abject failure in and of itself. In the context of what I'm talking about, if someone is trying to completely avoid the use of ammunition, then they are attempting to make their bullets a virtually infinite and technically useless resource. There is technically the potential of scavenging for more ammunition, but if society is still in session and you put yourself in a situation where you, let's say, find more ammunition, you'll likely soon have far greater issues than running out of said ammo. Another difference in our modern world is that the modern survivalist must recognize, even with his superior technology, that there is a new organism that sits above him in the food chain. That organism is the collective will of society. Such an organism can kill not only the survivalist, but the very place or places that he turns to as sanctuary. This becomes a greater threat every day we allow our natural areas to be turned into profitable enterprises. Part 3. The danger of morality. In a scenario where society is abandoned rather than escaped, every survivalist must, in addition to skills and equipment, acquire an extreme motivation in the form of his moral convictions. Escaping society because it's imploding is one thing, but abandoning society when it's still functioning is another entirely. If you live merely for the sake of being alive, there's little reason to resist any change in the social contract. If you don't have the deeply ingrained convictions to motivate your resistance, then you certainly won't have the motivation to live in a wilderness setting and to take on the challenges and risks associated with wilderness survival. Additionally, without those deep morals, an active society would have few practical reasons to be abandoned. Every man will face his creator knowing what he's compromised on. Without the deep moral convictions that prevent those moral compromises, the need for survival skills in this modern context are only sustained in the possibility of a true socioeconomic collapse wherein desperate people turn to marauding to survive. A modern survivalist must recognize that living in the wilderness obviously represents a major downgrade in overall quality of life. This means that morality becomes the only viable reason to abandon a functional society. If you decide to physically withdraw from society, then it's to prevent your captivity to a system which will oppress your beliefs and lifestyle. It's well known that animals survive longer in captivity. The same is true for humans. This is perhaps the ugliest truth to face. If you leave society, your life expectancy drops significantly. That's literally the antithesis of survival. This means that you must see your moral convictions as the true cause of your continued survival, and your resistance to whatever corrupt society would force upon you as holy rebellion. There are those that would rebel and fight a tyrannical government to maintain their position in collective society. This is noble, but unfortunately unpopular. They would quickly be branded as domestic terrorists, stripped of their rights, and destroyed by their fellow countrymen using technology far beyond what the Founding Fathers ever anticipated. Patriotism of that rebellious ilk has been systematically conditioned out of the American people. It's far more likely that freedom dies in the applause of the conditioned masses rather than on the field of battle. I do have respect for those who would fight that kind of tyranny and wish them Godspeed. But the inherent un-American tyranny of the collective over the individual is not targetable. If it was, the outcome of that conflict has already been foretold for those who are religious in the book of Revelation. For those who aren't religious, well, their morality is ultimately subjective anyways. I hold freedom in its highest regard, not simply because I'm an American or because it's guaranteed by our Constitution, but because it's literally our God-given free will. What man has the right to lay claim to God's creation, and what man has the right to limit the free will of another? True freedom isn't easy or granted, neither is it safe or comfortable. When legislation is introduced that conflicts with objective morality and limits your freedoms in the name of safety and prosperity for the voting majority, your God-given rights will be the casualty. Despite what most people are conditioned to think, freedom is not the permission to comply. It is in the synchronicity of the survivalist's skills, systems, and morals that modern survival is possible. Any conflict between these will create a dissonance which will prove fatal. Fully eliminating your autonomical limitations that depend on other people is merely the vehicle of your independence. This is no small task, and I think this challenge in our modern world is fundamentally different from what our ancestors faced. If you can really appreciate the difficulty of such a challenge, then hopefully you can see the wisdom in stationary prepping for all situations except the very worst. My great hope is that the acquisition of the means for true wilderness self-reliance is merely a rewarding hobby with healthy and economical benefits that will never be put to use seriously. But only time will tell.